Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Laura Kovacs, and I'm honored to be here this evening to introduce Tessa Hadley. In 5 novels and 2 collections of stories, Tessa Hadley has earned a reputation as both a writer's writer and a writer that readers trust, acclaimed for rendering the unabashedly ordinary yet undoubtedly captivating nuance of family drama. Her novels include Clever Girl, Accidents in the Home, which was long-listed for the Guardian First Book Award, Everything Will Be All Right, and The London Train, a New York Times notable book. Her 2 short story collections, Sunstroke and Married Love, were New York Times notable books as well. Her work also regularly appears in The New Yorker. A reviewer for the Wall Street Journal says her fiction is devoted to capturing personality through small actions and expressions, to sparking characters into a vivid flame with a few exact descriptions, and to distilling domestic settings into precious, even exalted significance. In her new novel, The Past, secrets and tensions boil to the surface during a sweltering, 3-week-long family reunion. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Tessa Hadley to the stage.
How lovely to be back in Philadelphia in the Free Library. I was here, we were just working it out. I actually couldn't remember exactly when it was, but Laura had a baby a week later, so she knew exactly. And I was saying, I remember hot, but October, do you have hot here? She said, believe me, it was hot. So, great. I'm going to start by reading to you. I'll talk a tiny bit about the book before I begin. I'll read something from the very beginning of my story, which, strangely, I don't quite know why I haven't done before. I've sort of begun, I did readings from this in the UK in the autumn, and now I've been doing some over here. And I don't know why. I haven't ever read from the opening, so I thought, why don't I just do that simple, obvious thing, and it means I don't really need to explain anything. But I might. I'll see how it goes. And how it feels as I read. But I might also pick something from my middle section. I'm kind of assuming most of you, probably all of you, haven't read it. It's very new. Let me give you, without spoiling anything, some sort of a sense of this book. Which I'll begin by saying something about my last book, which was called Clever Girl, my last novel. And that was the story of a woman's life, told actually in the first person, and it covered 50 years. It began with her as a little girl, and it moved up to, she was more or less 50. And I, chose, as it were, the crucial episodes from that life. So when I came to writing my next novel, I reacted to that, and I wanted to do the opposite. And I thought, I want to write a whole novel just as long as that one, but I want it to just take 3 weeks of time. Not 3 weeks of my time, of course. 2 years of my time, but 3 weeks of fictional time. And, I was sort of really feeling in the mood for the opposite challenges that would bring. The possibility of, have I got enough to write? But equally the opportunity to just go deeply, deeply into the things I set up, the scenes, the relations, the happenings. I could really dwell on them. So my novel does more or less take 3 weeks of real time, more or less in our present. A couple of years ago, I suppose it's set in England, in the west of England, in the countryside. And the story is that 4 middle-aged siblings gather for a 3-week holiday in the English summer, which, as you know, is not guaranteed to be hot, like here in Philadelphia, even in October. But it is. It happens to be. It's a lovely, at least they get a fortnight or 2 weeks of beautiful, unbroken, fine weather. And you can imagine how the writer feels about that. They feel, I'm really enjoying building this hot weather. It's lovely. And at some point, I'm going to have all the fun of the rain coming. So I did do that, indeed, at some point. Anyway, so as I was writing my 3 weeks, 4 siblings gathered together, remembering it was their grandparents' house. They know this house intimately. It's built into their inner lives because they have history there of the most important kind. Their grandfather was a minister in the little ancient church which is next door, and their mother brought them there often. She brought them there for holidays, obviously, to visit their grandparents, but actually, crucially, she brought them once when she left their dad, and sort of scooped her kids up in disgust at her husband at something he'd done, and brought them back down to her parents. And as I wrote this book, I suddenly had a sense that this 3-week arc, this long, lazy summer spell, needed something different in the middle for the rhythm or the music of the story to come right. So, actually quite late on, surprisingly late on, about a third of the way through, I suddenly realized at some point I want to dip my novel down out of its present into the deep past. And I actually go back to that other time in 1968, as it turns out, when that mum brought those 3 little children, there are 4 in the present, but there were only 3 then, one wasn't born, back to her parents' home. So I have, it's nice and tight as a structure for a novel. I'm still in the same house, pretty much furnished the same way, but my siblings who are in their 40s, in the present of this novel, suddenly I'm writing about them as children, which was a very strange feeling, actually. So, anyway, as I'm reading, I'll see how it goes, but I might read a little bit from 1968, May 1968, which might ring a bell. Stuff was happening in Paris. Everybody thought the world was going to change forever and ever. It didn't feel quite like that in a sleepy English country village in Somerset, but there were echoes from Paris. Anyway, but I'm going to begin at the beginning, so I don't need to tell you anything at all. Alice was the first to arrive, but she discovered as she stood at the front door that she had forgotten her key. The noise of their taxi receding like an insect burrowing between the hills was the only sound at first in the still afternoon, until their ears got used to other sounds. The jostling of water in the stream that ran at the bottom of the garden, a tickle of tiny movements in the hedgerow and grasses. At least it was an afternoon of balmy warmth, its sunlight diffused because the air was dense with seed floss, transparent winged midges, pollen. Light flickered on the grass, and under the silver birch leaf shadows shifted, blotting their penny shapes upon one another. Searching through her bag, Alice put on a show of amusement and scatty self-deprecation. She was famously hopeless with keys. She had come with a young man who was her ex-boyfriend's son, and on the train she had been preoccupied with the question of what stage of life she was at, whether people seeing them would think Kazim was her lover or her child, though he wasn't either. Now he walked away from her around the house without saying anything, and she thought that this mishap with the keys had shriveled her in his opinion. He was bored already. They were in the country, in the middle of nowhere, with no way back. The house was set behind a cluster of houses on a no-through road where there was no cafe or pub or even shop where they could pass the time. Behind her smiles, she raged at Kazim for a moment. She wished now that she hadn't brought him. It had been a careless suggestion in a moment of feeling bountiful, having this place to offer. She hadn't really expected him to take her up on it and to be flattered when he did. But if she had been alone, the keys wouldn't have mattered. It would have been a kind of bliss, even, to be shut out from the responsibility of opening up the house and making it ready for the others. She could have dropped onto the grass in the sunshine. She could have let go her eternal vigilance and fallen deep down here in this place, Kington, of all places, into sleep, the real thing, the sleep she was always seeking for and could never quite get. Alice was 46, dark, soft, concentrated yet indefinite. She could look like a different person in different photographs. Her complex personality was diffuse, always flying away in different directions, like her fine hair, which a man had once described as prune-coloured. It was soft and brown like the inside of prunes, and she wore it curling loose on her shoulders. The house was a white cube 2 stories high, wrapped around on all 4 sides by garden, with French windows and a veranda at the back and a lawn sloping to a stream. The walls inside were mottled with brown damp. There was no central heating, and the roof leaked. On the mossy roof slates, thick as pavings, you could see the chisel marks where the quarrymen had dressed them 200 years ago. Alice and Kazim stood peering through the French windows. The interior seemed to be a vision of another world, its stillness pregnant with meaning like a room seen in a mirror. The rooms were still furnished with her grandparents' furniture. Wallpaper glimmered silvery behind the spindly chairs, upright black-lacquered piano and bureau. Paintings were pits of darkness suspended from the picture rail. Alice had told her therapist that she dreamed about this house all the time. Every other house she'd lived in seemed, beside this one, only a stage set for a performance. Kazim didn't care about not getting inside. Vaguely, he was embarrassed because Alice had made a fool of herself. He wasn't sure how long he would stay anyway, and he had only come to get away from his mother, who was anxious because he wasn't studying. At the end of his first year at university, he was bored. He imagined he could smell the room's musty old age through the glass. The carpet was bleached and threadbare where the sun patched it. When he found a cheerfully shabby grey Renault parked on the cobbles beside the outhouses, he called to Alice. Alice didn't drive and couldn't tell one car from another, but looking inside, she knew it must belong to Harriet, her older sister. There was a box with maps in it on the back seat, and next to it, on a folded newspaper, a pair of shoes neatly side by side with one striped sock tucked into the top of each. "I know exactly what she's done," she said. "Arrived here, left the car and gone straight off for a walk before the rest of us got here. She's that sort of person. She loves nature and communes with it in a principled way. She thinks I'm frivolous." The little display of ordered privacy made Harriet seem vulnerable to Alice. It touched and irritated her. "Perhaps your sister forgot her key too." Harriet's never forgotten anything in her life. Because they couldn't get inside the house, Alice felt obliged to go on showing things to Kazim. She took him into the churchyard through a keyhole gap in a stone wall in the back garden. Her grandfather had been the minister here. The house and the church stood together on the rim of a bowl of air scooped deep between the surrounding hills, and buzzards floated on thermals in the air below them. The ancient stubby tower of the church, blind without windows, seemed sunk in the red earth. The nave was disproportionately all window by contrast, and the clear old quavering glass made its stone walls appear weightless. You saw straight through to the green of trees on the far side. In the churchyard, the earth was upheaved as turbulently as a sea by all the burials in it, and overgrown at one end with tall hogweed and rusty dock. Her grandparents' grave, red granite, still looked shiny new after a quarter of a century. Her grandfather had been very high church, Alice said, incense and the authorized version and real hell, or at least some clever, complicated kind of hell. He was a very educated man and a poet, a famous poet. Kazim was studying economics. He didn't care about poetry, though he didn't care much about economics either. Loose-jointed, he ambled after Alice round the churchyard, hands in pockets, only half interested, head cocked to listen to her. Alice always talked a lot. Kazim was very tall and much too thin, with brown skin and a big nose lean as a blade. His smudged black eyes drooped eloquently at the corners, the lower lids purplish, fine-skinned. His blue-black hair was thick as a pelt. He was completely English and unmistakably something else, too. His paternal grandfather, a Punjabi judge, had been married briefly to an English novelist. Now, Alice was worrying that he would find the country tedious. Somehow this hadn't occurred to her when she'd invited him in London. What she loved best in Kington was doing nothing, reading or sleeping. It was obvious now they'd arrived that this wouldn't be enough for Kazim, and she sagged under her responsibility to entertain him. Because he was young and she was 46, she was afraid of failing to interest him. She would be crushed if he didn't like it here. Alice was painfully stalled by beginning to lose her looks. She had always believed that it was her personality and intelligence which gave her what power she had. Her looks she had taken for granted. Okay. So I might move on. We're still in the same scene, same arrival, same day. And now her younger sister, Fran, has arrived. Harriet's still out on her walk. We haven't met her yet. And Fran has arrived without a husband, but with her two children, Ivy and Arthur. And all you need to know as well is that there's another sibling, the brother Roland, hasn't arrived yet, but he will arrive with his new third wife and his 16-year-old daughter by his first marriage, Molly. They get mentioned, so. Alice went round the house to air it. She's got inside, of course. Fran had a key. Alice went round the house to air it, singing and opening doors and windows. She was all right now she was inside. Leaning out of an upstairs bedroom, she called and waved to Kazim coming through from the churchyard. He was trying to shake off Ivy, 9-year-old Ivy, who followed close behind. He waved back without unplugging his cigarette. Turning away from him into the room again, Alice was subject to a leap of promise that had no relation to Kazim or to anyone, certainly not to Kazim's father, Danny. Light moving on pink wallpaper, the dark bulk of a wardrobe in the corner of her vision, the children's voices from outside, the room's musty air and its secrets, a creak of floorboards. These aroused a memory so piercing and yet so indefinite that it might only have been a memory of a dream. There was summer in the dream and a man and some wordless, weightless signal of affinity passing between him and her with everything to play for. This flare of intimation buoyed Alice up and agitated her, more like anticipation than recollection. Love seemed again luxuriant and possible, as if something lay in wait. She went along the landing, breathless and aware of her heart beating. Upstairs, the house was always full of light, changing dramatically according to the weather. Its design was very simple. A single flight of wide, shallow stairs rose to a long landing with a white-painted balustrade. At each end of the landing, at the centre of the front and back elevations of the house, there rose the tall, arched windows that were its distinctive beauty from inside and out. In the front bedroom that was always hers, Alice knelt at the bookshelf, guiltily aware all the time of Fran at work downstairs unpacking the shopping. The house was full of children's books, not only from her own and her siblings' childhood, but from their dead mothers too. Book plates with Alice's name written in the shakily flowing cursive she'd been taught at school were pasted inside the covers of hers with dates. As if in a form of divination, she opened one at random, E. Nesbit's The Would-Be-Goods, and read a page or two. The very weight of the book in her hands and the thick, good paper of the pages as she turned them, and the illustrations with the boys in their knickerbockers and the girls in pinafores seemed to bring back other times. the times when she had first read this, and behind that, the time when such children might have existed. Fran was peeling potatoes in the kitchen sink when Alice came in looking for scissors, wanting to cut flowers in the garden. When you decided to invite Kazim, Fran said, where exactly were you planning for him to sleep? Alice was blithe. Don't worry, there's plenty of room. She banged through the drawers in vain, looking hopelessly around her. Don't we have scissors? Fran lifted them from their place, hanging on a row of wall hooks, and handed them over. I presume he's not in with you. Oh, for God's sake, Kazim is something like my stepson almost. Only asking, I never know with you. I'm an ancient old woman as far as he's concerned. The children adore him, by the way. Everywhere he goes, they go in procession after him. Kazim has his hands in his pockets, and now Arthur's copying him. He looks so sweet. Is there room, then? Fran persisted, bent over her peeling. Molly has to have a room of her own, obviously. She's not a child any longer. Alice was forced to start counting up bedrooms and beds on her fingers. Oh dear, I'd forgotten Molly. Roland, and whatever her name is, the new wife. You, Kazim, Harriet, Molly, that's 5 bedrooms. There are only 6. It means I have to sleep in with the children in the bunk bedroom. Oh, Fran, that's awful. You need a break more than any of us. You need your privacy. No, I'll sleep with them. It's all my fault. I don't mind, really. Don't be silly, Fran said punishingly. You know that isn't going to happen. Penitent, Alice got out their grandmother's vases from the scullery and filled them with water on the kitchen table. Right in my way, Fran grumbled when she was out of earshot. Alice brought in roses and Montbretia and purple linaria from the garden where only the toughest plants survived their long absences. Then she put out flowers all round the house, a posy for every dressing table, white roses and ferns for the new wife. She arranged the supermarket fruit in bowls. Fran had brought new tea towels in bright colours, rooms filled with the smells of cooking. In between their visits, it was as if the empty house lapsed into a kind of torpor and was frigid and reluctant at first when they had to rouse it back to life. I could stop there, or I could read you a little bit from 1968. Okay, those who were vociferous get it, and those who were silent hoping I'd stop, sorry. Okay. So now we meet their mother, who is sadly dead, in the present section. She's brought the children home. She's getting away from her husband, and you're about to discover why. In those late afternoons, their mother sometimes played the piano, and the sound came floating out past Alice, eating through the daisies in her playpen set on the lawn, to where Hetty, that's Harriet, Hetty and Roland were busy in the stream, building a dam across it, Hetty snapping out orders to Roland. The music, while it lasted, seemed to frame and characterize their life in a way which was poignant and satisfying, as if they could see it from a long way off. The children were always surprised that their mother could play at all. The piano seemed to speak quintessentially of acres of empty time dedicated to dreamy introspection, which they did not associate with her. Then Jill would break off impatiently when she made a mistake in the middle of some rippling passage, crushing both her hands down on the piano keys crossly, slamming the lid shut. They were half aware that their mother was boiling up with trouble the whole time they were adapting to life in Kington, settling down there. "I can't bear this," she said aloud once, rather calmly, with her hands still raised in that impressive way, curving and passionate, poised above the notes. "What can't you bear?" Sophie said. Sophie is Jill's mother, the children's grandmother, the vicar's wife. "What can't you bear?" Sophie said. She was patting out a soft dough for scones with floury hands on the kitchen table. Jill had come in to cook the baby's supper and was crouching, banging through the saucepans in a corner cupboard, looking for a small one. Not being able to play through those pieces I used to know, it's so frustrating. Her mother began pressing a glass into the dough, cutting rounds of scone and setting them out on a baking tray, while Jill sat back thoughtfully on her heels on the linoleum with the saucepan in her hand. And that's not all. There's quite a lot I can't bear just at the moment. My husband, for instance, if you really want to know, that marriage is pretty much over, I should say. I made a mistake with Tom, and it hasn't worked out. So there we are. She put on a sprightly, debunking voice, as if all this was a subject for a light, bright, clever irony. And Sophie went on, pressing down the glass into the dough, close up each time against the last cut-out round for minimum waste. I knew something was wrong, she exclaimed, but without looking at her daughter. I've decided to come back and live down here, Jill said. Mikey Waller's helping me look for a place to rent. Perhaps I could find a little job. I thought you wouldn't mind looking after the children just a couple of mornings a week. What kind of little job? Anything. I don't care. I thought of asking in the library. You're a wicked girl, Sophie said. When she had stamped out as many rounds as she could, she gathered up the leftovers, pressing them together into a new ball, flattening this with deft fingers. To tempt me so dreadfully. I can't think of anything I'd rather have in the whole world than all of you living down here. I'd be so happy having you nearby all the time. Or here at the rectory, for goodness sake. What are all those spare rooms for? Helping you look after the children. I'd love it more than anything. But, Jill said, you're going to say, but. It's not possible. But I have to be good or something. We can't all just have what we want in life. You're going to remind me of my duty, that I ought to stay with him for the sake of the children or whatever. Those things just don't mean anything anymore, Mum. They don't count for anything. Women have seen through them. Anyway, you haven't even asked what's wrong. So, what's wrong? Jill sighed and put up the cool metal of the saucepan against her face. Well, he sleeps with other women for a start. That's the easy bit. Sophie began stamping out new scone rounds, dipping the glass into the flour bag, grinding it down thoughtfully into the dough. How many other women? Mum, you're funny. What does it matter how many? I don't know. One at least, quite definite, that he's owned up to recently. I found her underwear, if you want to know the sordid detail, in my bed when I stripped it to wash the sheets, all crumpled up, sort of fossilized, because I don't wash them that often, down over the edge at the end, caught between the layers. He brought her home when I took the children off to Candice Markham's for the weekend. They must have hunted everywhere. She had to go home without her knickers, poor Vanda. She must have thought he'd stolen them to keep in his pocket or something. Frilly red nylon ones that couldn't possibly ever have been mine. In the underwear department, I'm still very much the vicar's daughter in my white cotton. Poor Vanda. He doesn't even like her very much. Jill said she was sure there had been other women too. Two at least that I have suspicions over. He's probably with someone right now, some dirty little Parisian Maoist he's got off with on the manifestation. The point is, he doesn't have qualms as long as he can get away with it. But the unfaithfulness isn't the major problem. Maybe he's right. We don't need to own each other. Maybe I could get lovers of my own. We could balance things out. It was lucky, Jill thought, that she was sitting here on the floor. From her unusual perspective, everything in this kitchen that was as familiar as life itself looked unexpected, so that these extraordinary words, which didn't belong in here, could flow freely out of her mouth, liberated by the room's new strangeness. She could see from where she was sitting the grubby, stained underside of the kitchen table, the side which was not bleached each week by Mrs. Cummins, and metal struts that had been screwed in at some point, fastening the top more securely against the legs. The real problem is that I just don't admire Tom anymore. I don't just mean him being unfaithful. I mean intellectually as a thinker and a writer. I used to believe he was so brilliant. He was my guide to everything. He showed me how to find my way in the world. But But now I can see all the lazy patterns in his thinking, all the shortcuts. He doesn't know half as much as he pretends he does. He's full of enthusiasms, but he doesn't think things through deeply. What am I supposed to do with that discovery? I don't know how to be with him if I can't look up to him. I'm programmed to believe that the man I choose must be my master. I know that's an absurd expectation, but I can't seem to unpick it from where it's stitched into my psyche. Jill had never said any of these things aloud before. She hardly even knew if they were true. And her mother didn't care anyway about cleverness. She wouldn't be on Jill's side over that. She believed that women should keep their skepticism and criticism hidden, not risk exposing themselves as the men exposed themselves by pronouncing with any certainty. But Sophie must be half triumphant at the same time, hearing all these things about Tom. In recent years, Jill's relationship with her mother had often seemed to be a silent tussle, Sophie's unspoken judgment against Tom pushing up against her daughter's defense of him. Now Sophie was painting the tops of the scones with egg and milk beaten together, and she asked what Jill was going to cook for the baby's dinner. Would Alice eat the cauliflower cheese left over from yesterday? Jill stared hopelessly inside her empty pan. She didn't like it very much, did she? I was imagining some boiled potatoes with peas and grated cheese on top. That sounds like a good solution. Sophie opened the oven door in the Rayburn with a tea towel, slid the tray of scones inside, rummaged in the vegetable crock for potatoes. You'd be surprised, she said, how you can think you've made up your mind about things and got to the bottom of them, and then there's a sort of swerve in the road, or you turn a corner and everything looks different all over again, as if you're driving through a new landscape. Really? Does that really happen? Sophie considered carefully. To a certain extent. Jill slumped in her corner as if a certain extent wasn't enough. Incidentally, her mother said, I don't care as much as you might imagine about being good, but I really don't think you ought to come home, however much I would love it. I think you ought to stay out there in the world where things are happening. If I were you, then that's what I would want. I wouldn't want to come back here. There's nothing for you here.
Well, I'm a lifelong New Yorker subscriber, and one of the things I love about reading stories in the New Yorker is I'm always with the yellow highlighter, interesting things, and that's how I came to be interested in you. And I remember one particular thing, I didn't bring it, I can't quote it, but something about her life was as cluttered as her car. I can really relate to that.
I often, people tell me bits of my stories and I actually can't remember where they come from, but I do know where that comes from. It came from a story about two cleaners and the sort of the person whose mind we're inside. It's her friend's car, and she drives with the light of the car on and boxes of tissue and bits of blanket on the front seat. Yes, I kind of love cars like, well, I quite like cars like that, but she's quite a dangerous driver as well, I seem to remember.
This isn't a particularly well thought out question, but as a feminist, I never really wanted to believe that men and women were so different, and yet when I think about men, I find them kind of unfathomable. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about writing sort of across difference and inhabiting the heads of people who are not like you.
I'm so sympathetic to that, yes. And it's so interesting, isn't it? I mean, of course, as far as the writer's concerned, you don't actually have to decide whether the differences between men and women are hardwired biology or whether they are just culture. All you have to do is watch them, watch the culture, if you like, and leave the theorists to make up their mind about the other thing. And it's pretty obvious that in our deep history and our recent history, there are just wonderful, rich differences which are a feast for novelists. As for this thing about whether we can write men, we ought to be able to, because we live with them or we close up against them, we know them intimately. And I do think it's probably easier to write men, for women to write men, for men to write women, than it is to write people in a different class, actually, people in a different country for sure, because we can watch them, we can study them. Having said all that, and I have that very strong conviction that it's possible, I would have to say that I think I find it harder. I think I might be gaining confidence, and I thought I believed in the man I wrote in the London train, who actually sort of, we are inside his head for half the book, and I kind of, I didn't feel anxious about him. I felt I knew how he thought and how he would act. And of course, it's terribly liberating, actually, as a woman, to suddenly be a man and have those opportunities instead of the different ones, to paths to go down imaginatively. What I tend to feel when I'm writing my men is that they don't have to try to please so hard, that there's a kind of cold fearlessness to their thinking that you can put on the page. Now, that isn't to say that at their important moments, my women don't have the same truth-seekingness. Absolutely they do. But in social interaction, I can't think of a precise example, but I know I've used the thing of women having to say, talk to everyone, be nice, make it work, make the family work, and the man's just able to say, I don't want to. Why would I do that? And actually that feels quite fun, being inside it for a while. In the novel tradition, great male novelists have just written women so well that I refuse to believe that women, of course, George Eliot wrote Dr. Lydgate in Middlemarch and Bulstrode, and there are so many rich examples. Jane Austen, fantastic at men, although it's so fascinating. I don't know if you've ever noticed reading Jane Austen that we never, ever, ever, ever have a scene without women present. Because she knows, the writer knows, that she doesn't know how men sound when they're together. But she gives us little glimpses of it. There's a moment when Emma is making a complete fool of herself, saying, oh, I think Mr. Elton will marry Harriet. And Mr. Knightley warns her. He said, I've heard Elton talking, and I don't think he'll... And suddenly you have a thought that when these men are together, they're not so sweet, you know? And that Elton would not have thought about that silly little girl, that he's got his eye on money and advancement, and women's talk. Austen knows that some women's talk is quite foolish when it's all in the drawing room, and that they are ill-informed about what men are doing, they're certainly saying when they are alone together. Yeah, that was a bit of a detour, but sort of germane to your point.
I'm thinking of a story of yours that begins in a way that is similar to this novel. People are arriving at the railroad station. I think there are 4 characters. They're going to empty the house.
Yeah, okay.
But
I had a panicking feeling you were going to describe another story I hadn't written, and I'd be letting you down again. I do know what you're talking about. It's a story called The Godchildren, where 3 people now in middle age. It is a little like this. You're absolutely right.
It is so technically accomplished in that short space to manage that introduction. I was just blown away by that.
Lovely, thank you. And I'm so glad that it stayed with you, and that's exactly how stories stay with me when I read them in the New Yorker. As sort of a miasma of impressions, and then who wrote that one, and what was it called? But that's lovely. I'm so pleased, yeah. You're quite right. I hadn't thought that before. I use a similar structure, a house, actually, a house full of the past, to bring together 3, in that case, it's not 3 siblings, it's 3 people who do not know each other in their middle age, but were very close as teenagers in that house. And it's more broadly comic in a way than this book, but sort of poignant as well, I hope.
So I was wondering if you would address, sometimes when your work is reviewed, reviewers will mention the quiet mastery. And the word quiet is actually used fairly often. And I would contend that your work is not quiet. There's tons of action. Murders in the last book. No spoilers for this one, but pornography, adultery. Would you address that?
I'd love to, actually, because I do get called quiet, and I almost think in my last book, Clever Girl, that I almost thought, well, damn it. I'm going to put some... So I really do have 2 murders in it, and it's not a crime thriller or anything. I have 2 people violently killed. I have a sort of teenage pregnancy. I have every kind of disaster, but no, quiet and domestic. And you think, what does a girl have to do? So I don't know quite where that comes from. You know, it's... No, okay, let me be a bit feminist about this. I sometimes think that when men write novels about drama within family, they get praised for their audacity and their sort of exposure of the truth about family, and when women write stories about drama in family, they're called domestic or quiet. And maybe that's not quite fair, but I didn't mean... That sounds like sour grapes. I love my reviews. It's fine. But I don't quite know where that comes from, because what I find when you lift the lid of a little scene like this, these siblings, what you find is seething passion. You find the terrible shadow of a loss hanging over them, obviously having formed them. In the middle of it, their mother trying to negotiate her way through sexual betrayal, and more than that, the huge feminist revolution of the middle of the century, fighting for what a woman might be. And then Harriet, who I haven't read anything about her to you, but she is the oldest sister is quite dried and repressed and inhibited and locked up, and something kind of tiny but terrible happens to her early on in the novel. She just is an involuntary witness to something sexual, which much too late in her life unlocks a door, and she is smitten with a passion for somebody else in the house. I won't give too much away, I don't want to be a spoiler, which ravages her. It undoes her. And what more is there to life? There is, of course, there's war and there's disaster. But first of all, I don't think I know how to write that. And I think the novel itself, the form, except in the hands of the most exceptional writers, strains under that kind of subject matter. Really, the novel and the family, the novel and the everyday, by which I don't mean quiet, I just mean the drama that happens every day. The novel and the everyday are a perfect fit. It was when Western culture got interested in everyday life, private life, individual life. That's when the novel started, in the 18th century, when people retreated into their families, inside the rooms of their houses, away from the public. And that was when the novel grew up. And the slow meandering of the novel form, with its detail and its space to go into character, and its space for lots of little things to build up and add up to something big, is exactly like daily life. And I kind of think there's a perfect match there. And it's very, very difficult to write horror, disaster. I'm haunted by that, though. I'm haunted by the scale of the things outside domestic life and family life. And what I try and do is to put the traces of those shadows, put the haunting into the everyday, so that my characters are haunted by those things. That's the most honest thing I can do, I think.
I'm not quite finished, but almost, with the past. And I'm rather intrigued by little Ivy. And she's not exactly like Harriet was when she was a child, but I'm wondering if you could talk about Ivy, because she's so busy doing what she's doing, and no one seems to be looking after her.
It is fascinating, isn't it, how nobody knows what the children are doing the whole time. And I tell you, the children are better informed about almost everything than the grown-ups are. They know what's in that cottage. None of the adults who would be terribly interested ever know. They don't even listen when the children... I'm spoiling a bit, but it doesn't matter. It's crucial. Even when the children eventually tell them what's upstairs in that cottage, the grown-ups do not listen. And they know about Molly, and, you know, they are watching everything. And I kind of love that in children, because I just think that's what they do. That the grown-ups write them into a corner of innocent ignorance, which makes the grown-ups feel better. And actually, children without the film of convention or fear or hope for... Well, no, they have lots of fear, that's not right. But without convention in front of their eyes, they see. There's a lovely novelist who I'm mad about of the mid-20th century called Ruma Godden. I don't know if anybody reads her. She's marvelous, isn't she? And she, when she writes her white English, British colonials growing up, in India, it's marvelous how the adults live this rigid colonial lifestyle with Indian servants, and there's a gulf, but the children of those white colonial administrators are able to genuinely visit the bazaar and see what they're forbidden to see, and eat the sweets they're totally forbidden to eat, and watch the monkeys copulating in the fairground, you know, for show, and see the beggars with their bleeding sores. All the things that the adults fondly believe are too much for children. But maybe it's the adults they're too much for. The children greedily seek out. They need to know. They need to know what's in life. They need to know about death, and even they need to know about sex. And here Ivy turning over the pages of those damp, old, horrible, pornographic magazines she finds in the cottage, thinking, who are these women? And then later Arthur thinks, why aren't there any men? You know, they're puzzling it out for themselves. That's where autonomy begins.
You mentioned that your characters, you'd bring in what they're haunted about, or you allude to what they're haunted about. I wanted to ask you about the relationship of the world that you're portraying. How do your characters relate to the wider world, to people who are in other social classes, who are aware of the troubles of the world? How do you see that?
Yeah. Two sort of lines I can take in answering that. One of which is that I really hope that my little slice of intimate family life is also a slice of history. That's what the novel does. Whether it doesn't need to make great efforts to do so. But I haven't accidentally placed the past in May 1968. You know, we are watching a cultural evolution over those decades in expectation, gender relations, economy. Actually, that's all in there. In terms of, you know, what I was talking about just now and what you're referring to, how do I bring into this middle class family? They are very middle class by education, by occupation, not by money, by the way. They're all as poor as church mice. Maybe the brother has probably made some money, not much, but you know, we know this vicarage is not furnished with antiques. It's cheap 1940s utility furniture. They haven't got enough money to do it up or, you know, put a new roof on or mend the leaks even. So it's not money, but something else, education and confidence of a kind, cultural confidence. Anyway, so they're middle class, and they are that, particularly Harriet, the older sister, is that version of middle class, and I kind of have a strong feeling you have a very equivalent tradition here, nuanced slightly differently probably, but extremely conscientious, agonized by her own privilege as she perceives it. So she has actually spent her whole life, she now works with asylum seekers, helping them, you know, find accommodation, go through the court system to try and get proper refugee status, all that stuff. She actually has a past as a revolutionary, when she really believed for years that this social order had to be overthrown because it was so unjust. She stopped believing that. She stopped believing in the revolution, but it didn't stop her feeling the inequity. She's agonized by it, actually. So I suppose I couldn't possibly write a novel in which I described the social condition of Britain because I couldn't do it as well as a sociology book, and because I would be preaching, and because I'd be writing often about what I didn't know securely enough. So what I want to do is watch them in the middle of that. Watch it on their faces, leaving its traces on their lives and in their conversation and in their behaviors. I suppose that's the best answer to what you asked.
Hi, thank you
Hi.
for coming to Philadelphia. It's great to have you here again. You mentioned Rumor Garden as one of your favorites. Can you share who's on your bedstand and who you like to read?
I am a great rereader, actually. I'm reasonably well read in the contemporary novel, but I often wait for a bit to sort of see whether the fuss dies down or not. I mean, of my contemporaries, I'm a huge fan of Colm Tóibín, who actually I read with last time I was here, and I'm not saying that. I simply love his books. I love them. I have done from the very first time I read. Which one? What's the one about the judge? No, I love that too, but it's not the one about the gay young man. It doesn't matter. Anyway, he's marvelous. The Heather Blazing. The Heather Blazing is what it's called. And I also love. I'm saying this name a lot while I'm here this time because I get the feeling you don't read him here as much as maybe we do, and I think Americans would just love him. Do you know John McGahern? No. Just wonderful. He's an Irish writer, again, a ridiculous, disproportionate number of great Irish writers. How do they do it? Is it in the water? I don't know. Anyway, he's absolutely superb. Yes, I will. So it's John, then McGahern, so MC, then capital G, A-H-E-R-N. Great novelist, wonderful memoirist, the most terrible, sad story of his childhood, his mother, which I'm not going to be able to remember the name of, but you'd find it easily. But I think the short stories are the best thing of all. They are superbly good. And in fact, I had a lovely conversation with Colm Tóibín last time we were here, walking back across Slogan Square to what was then the Four Seasons. And I was saying how much I love John McGahern's stories, and he was talking about how they'd been quite close. And he was saying that John McGahern had thought that Colm's writing The Master, his book about Henry James, was a terrible mistake, that he should have just stuck to what he knew. So there we are, isn't that interesting? Anyway, so that's two lovely writers. It's almost unnecessary to mention that I think Alice Munro is one of the greatest writers of our time. Of course, marvelous, just actually incredibly important to me. I almost don't say it because it's too much. Sort of opened a door for me into becoming a writer, definitely. I love Anne Tyler. I love Nadine Gordimer in her prime, those wonderful great novels, Burger's Daughter and A Guest of Honor and July's People. Perhaps some of the later ones, not so good, but who cares? She wrote lots. And another great short story writer, actually. And J.M. Coetzee, really loved some of them, and he's always interesting, even when he's so strange and maddening. And from the past, I'm a huge Elizabeth Bowen fan, from the mid-20th century. She's probably my other one, along with Alice Munro, my actual intimate that I have on my desk when I'm writing. When I'm feeling I'm not writing well enough, I look at one of Bowen's sentences and I think, okay, you've got to make it work as hard as that. And I go back, all inspired, like an adrenaline shot or something. Yeah, I love her.
When you're writing, do you know what you're going to write ahead of time? I mean, you told us how you were getting to this one, but do you know how the book will end up? Or
the one I'm working on now? No, yes, I mean, good question. And the answer is kind of yes and no. It's a bit different for a short story to a novel. I think one of my breakthroughs in my ridiculously long time it took me to be able to write anything any good was realizing that you didn't sit at the typewriter, as it still was then, looking into the blank, waiting for the next thing to come, that you must think ahead. It's so obvious and so stupid, but I actually remember discovering that, and it was like a light going on. So think ahead at least somewhat. Know where you're writing to, know where this section is going, and hopefully the section after that, because, yeah, otherwise you're just writing into the dark. So you need control and mastery of the whole shape, and when it's a novel, you really need to sort of, well, I'll tell you what I always tell my students. I teach writing, and when I see the ones who are going to work one-to-one with me on their novels, I say, where's this going to be a third of the way through? Where's it going to be 2/3 of the way through? And they are quite blank about that often. They know where they are starting off. They've written 15 brilliant pages, or maybe not, but this is one particular girl I've just met. It's a beautiful opening. And then she knew how the book was going to end, vaguely, and she had no idea what was going to, I don't know what she was going to do, just see what happened. I do think it's so easy, and I know I did this, to feel that writing is rather like reading, and that as you wind the new page into your typewriter or open up the new, that you'll find it. Well, you won't. You have to dream it. You have to have some time away where you're thinking, what could happen? What could happen? He could drop dead. She could get pregnant. They could move to France. The house could fall down. You have to play with the story. And the really good thing is if you can make yourself a space where you're not panicking. I've got to have something to write tomorrow. I've got to have something to write tomorrow. But you're thinking quite a way ahead. So you feel very free. You think, I don't have to decide. Let me just play. So writing is a very painful mixture of something incredibly playful and dreamy. Has to be there. Otherwise it'll be dead. And something rather structured and controlling. And it's like two opposite energies, and the book needs both.
It's a perfect place to stop. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Tessa Hadley.